So far as I can tell, this is a real church sign and not a product of Photoshop. Regardless of whether this is a real sign or Photoshop, it expresses a sentiment of many people, especially atheists. That sentiment is that somehow faith and reason are incompatible. Hey folks, welcome to this edition of Short Studies with Steve. This is part 3 of the series I'm doing called Don't Check Your Brain at the Door. Now on the same blog spot where I found that picture, I found this comment. It says that it's actually, referring to the quote on the sign, of course, it's actually a quotation from Martin Luther in the context of his argument for fideism. Luther was arguing that because reason plays no part in coming to faith, in his view, and because using one's reason can undermine faith, it is therefore the enemy of faith. Since I don't have a theological dog in this fight, according to the writer of this comment, that is, in whether fideism is the appropriate view, I can't speak to that aspect. But yes, to judge from my experience with deconversions, mostly on internet infidels, the free exercise of reason is the enemy of faith. Now, fideism, I'd never heard this term until I did a little research on this sign, but fideism is the name given to a school of thought to which Tertullian himself is frequently said to have subscribed, and Tertullian was a early church father, which answers that faith is in some sense independent of, if not outright, adversarial toward reason. In contrast to the more rationalistic tradition of natural theology, where its arguments for the existence of God, fideism holds, or at any rate appears to hold, that reason is unnecessary and inappropriate for the exercise and justification of religious beliefs. The term itself derives from fides, the Latin word for faith, and can be rendered literally faithism. Fideism is thus to be understood not as a synonym for religious belief, but as denoting a particular philosophical account of faith's appropriate jurisdiction vis-a-vis that of reason. Okay, so are faith and reason incompatible? Well, let's see what the Oxford Dictionary has to say about all this. It defines reason as the ability to think and make judgments, especially good judgments. To think about and make a good judgment about something. To argue with and try to persuade someone. Does that really fit in with Christianity? Well, in a previous episode, we looked at how Jesus said to go and teach. And to teach means that you go in and present material, people think about it, and then you have discussion, you ask questions. Sounds a little bit like reason to me. And when you consider the definition of reason that we just got from the Oxford Dictionary, it is no enemy of Christianity. In fact, it is really one of the Christian's best friends. And in our last installment, we looked at how Christianity is spread by teaching, which involves asking questions. The teacher presents material, the student raises his hand, hey, I have a question. All right, what's your question? And then the teacher might even turn around and question the student. To do all that requires thinking. It requires judgment. It requires reasoning. Let's have a look at some scriptures. Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went in to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, This Jesus, whom I preach to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, joined Paul and Silas. Now, notice it says Paul spent 3 Sabbaths, which would be about 3 weeks, ministering to the Jews, and Luke used 3 different words to describe the ministry of Paul. Now, remember, we looked at the Oxford Dictionary definition of reason. Now, the New Testament's not written in English. It's written in Koine Greek. So, to understand what's happening here, we need to have a look at the Koine Greek definition of these words. So, what does it mean when we take those words and put them into English? Well, Paul reasoned or argued, some translations say he argued, which is the Greek word dialexato, which means to discuss or discussed or conversed. Paul was also explaining, which is there's the Greek word for it, which literally means opening. And it's even used of Jesus' instruction to the 2 men on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24 in verse 32, where he opened their minds. And then Paul proved, which is the Greek word, and it's a very long one right there, which carries the idea of bringing something forward as a way of proof. And I got this from the Life Application Commentary series. So when Paul finished, did everyone listen to him and just suck it up and say, yeah, Paul, let's follow you. And oh, by the way, here's my brain. I'm not going to be needing this. No, you look at the words Luke used. They are using words where people had to think. He had to argue. He debated. That's another word that sometimes gets, that Greek word gets translated. He debated. He argued. He persuaded. Now, that has to use the powers of reason. Paul came over here and he said X, Y, and Z. Well, let me think about that a minute. Paul, that doesn't make any sense. Would you explain? Okay, well, here's what I mean. And he could go into a better explanation. Look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, some of them were persuaded. And a great multitude of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. Some were persuaded. Now that word persuaded would carry the idea that they had to think about it and they accepted what Paul had to say. Some were persuaded, which tells us what? Well, obviously, some were not persuaded. Just like on Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost. 3,000 obeyed the gospel and were baptized into Christ that day. But what about all the rest of the people? See, there were some there that didn't obey the gospel. They didn't accept Peter's message. There are some here in Acts 17 that did not accept Paul's message either. If some were persuaded, that tells us some were not persuaded. Let's look at Acts 17, verse 17. Drop on down there. Paul goes to Athens, Greece, and while he's there, what does that say there? Let's see. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews, with the Gentile worshippers in the marketplace daily, with those who happened to be there. So he went into the synagogue because he knew there'd be an assembly of people there. Whoever was there, well, Paul would talk to them, and he would reason with them. He'd lay out his best case for why they needed to accept Christianity. And here's the word that shows up there in that text. It means to thoroughly, or rather to say thoroughly, to discuss in argument or exhortation. So how do we have dialogue? Well, dialogue requires at least two people to be talking. You'll say something, I'll think about it, okay, and then I'll give my reply. Hopefully we're both actually listening to what the other one is saying and not just concentrating on what our reply is going to be. Today we would call that active listening, where I'm maybe even going to repeat back to you what you just said. But to do that, for me to take in what you say and then give a reply requires thinking, requires reasoning, requires me to ask questions. So once again, we see that Christianity is not for the intellectually lazy. It is for someone who likes to think, who likes to reason things out. So what do you think about that? No, see, you got to think. Let me know in the comments section below, or you can shoot me an email at 2timothy4.2.3@gmail.com. Look forward to hearing whatever your comments are. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.